The relationship, I think, between government and PSA is not necessarily about agreement, but it is based on respect. And that is respect for the role of an organisation that has a deep institutional knowledge of public services, whose members are the face of public services to the New Zealand public. Insofar as everyone in New Zealand interacts with the public sector, then a significant part of that interaction is with your members. And so given our common interests in providing good public services to New Zealanders, we have many similar objectives, but of course some areas of disagreement. But disagreement does not undermine the respect for the work and experience of those who are on the front line. The performance of the public services through the Christchurch earthquake was, I think, the best demonstration I've ever seen of the kind of ethos that Brenda referred to, where people who were able to make practical decisions under very difficult conditions enabled hundreds of thousands of people in Christchurch to continue to have the reassurance of access to public services when a lot of the rest of their life was in chaos. And we hope to take advantage of the creativity that was unleashed there, where people closer to the front line were allowed to make decisions about what would work best, and made some fantastic innovations, and we need to work out how to harness those to take both the models that have come up in Christchurch, but also the staff engagement that went with it to export across more of the public sector. What I thought I'd do is to just run through some of the general ideas that are driving our thinking about public services, and talk a bit about some examples where we see these general ideas coming together. Because I think if there's at least a common understanding, if not common agreement, about what the government thinks it's trying to do, then we can have a sensible discussion. The first point is simply that restraint, financial restraint, is pretty much permanent now. We're already into the fourth year since the global financial crisis. The New Zealand government has run some of the biggest deficits it's ever run, or the biggest deficit it's ever run. And even as we get towards surplus over the next 2 or 3 years, there will be pressure on any extra money that the government has. And by those pressures, they'll range from restarting our contributions to the New Zealand Super Fund, which is there to underpin our national superannuation scheme, and we suspended contributions because we didn't have the money. On the one hand, through to rebuilding the earthquake fund, which has been cleaned out by Christchurch, and we want something here at Wellington had one, through to dealing with the inevitable pressures that will come on public services as we go through a number of years of restraint. So we're trying to do a pretty delicate balance here. In the long term, there isn't some big pot of money around the corner, but we have got a fair bit of money. And we want to, on the one hand, make sure we get to surplus, because that means public services can be sustainable. The best position for the public service to be in is that the government's books are in good shape, because that underpins their security. But we also need to provide a good level of public services. And that's, I think, the second point. The government has set out to continue to provide the same, if not better, public services, even though the money is tight. So we made a deliberate choice not to go for reductions in service. We believe that, particularly in times of uncertainty, the public need the security of knowing that their public services are going to continue and that they may indeed improve. Because regardless of the financial situation, public expectations are shifting. They expect to be able to do more things online. They expect more sensible use of their personal data or information. They expect things to becoming more convenient, easier to use. So that's the second point. We wanted to focus on doing more with less, that is maintaining or improving public services even though we're short of money. A third point, principle that's driving our thinking is that when we're trying to get the government's books in line and provide good public services, the best result for the government is what is the best result for the community. So if we want the government's books in shape in the longer term, then the best way to achieve that is to get good results out of our public sector. If we have one less prisoner reoffending, then that is the best outcome for the community and happens to have the best impact on the government's books. If we have one more child learning how to read, that is the best result for us. If we have one more family that is able to get into a decent level of housing where they can afford the rent or the mortgage, then that is the best result for the government's books. So we're aligning our savings with good results. We have not done what a number of other governments have chosen to do, and that is to go in and rip large-scale, short-term savings out of the public sector. And you just need to look at what's going on in Australia at both the state and federal level, where they're going for high levels, big redundancies, thousands of people out of work getting short-term savings. We made a decision not to do that. That we're willing to take the time to get better results and thereby get significant savings. So I can tell you from the way the numbers work that our more significant fiscal savings are out ahead of us, even though we're in our fourth year of dealing with very tight budgets, and that the majority of those savings will be delivered by successful service, not just by reducing costs. And because, so that brings me to the next point. Because we're trying to get make the government's books, get the government's books right by getting better results, then we have published, I think for the first time, 10 results that the government wants to focus on with respect to public services. And they fall into 4 categories. There's results that focus on our vulnerable children, on educational achievement, on law and order, and on the transactional services between government and businesses and government and the general public. And we have found already that the results, if we say to someone who's working in the public service, we need to reduce the number of children who are turning up to hospital with injuries, that's a powerful common motivator. It's not to say that people have been trying to do that for a long time, of course they have. But the systems haven't all been aligned to that. With the minister, everyone from the minister to the frontline social worker focused on it, because there's a strong common understanding of what they want to achieve. The same for educational achievement. We want to get the number of, level 2 is basically, level 2 NCA is the level we need to achieve for young people to go on to further training. And we need everybody from the Cabinet Committee I was at this morning through to the teacher's aide, having an understanding that that is what we're there to achieve. And of course, achieving better results needs the knowledge, experience and participation of the people who actually deliver the service. And in my view, the fact that we have these results published, announced by the Prime Minister, and therefore politically locked in, is going to make the task on the front line more important rather than less. And already you can feel the machine reorientating toward what is actually happening with the people for whom we are meant to be responsible and meant to be deploying taxpayers' money effectively. So achieving those better results, which are available on the websites and so on if you want to look at the detail, is going to need coherent and flexible organisations that can work with others. Because as we know, if we want to, in the examples I've mentioned, have lower prison reoffending rates or less child abuse, prisoners and vulnerable children do not live in government departments. They live in families and communities. And rather than expecting them, often the most vulnerable, to adapt to us and our system, we are trying to move further in a direction that's been well established for the last 10 or 15 years, and that is to move our delivery of services more in their direction, because that is what is going to happen, or more in the direction of the businesses whom government services, with a lot of its regulatory roles, more in the direction of people applying for licences, passports, paying their tax. And that is going to be a continuous job, not a revolution. And I want to acknowledge here the PSA's commitment and interest to the productive workplace, to continuous improvement. A significant portion of the public service management does need to understand those concepts better. They are a bit used to, some of them, a command and control structure where they issue instructions that may or may not be well informed, and people carry them out whether they're enthusiastic or not. Of course, that is not the ideal, and in the long run, that's not going to deliver the best level of service to the public. So I'd emphasise we're not looking for revolutions. That is why, with some exceptions, we've chosen not to go in for significant organisational restructuring in the public service, because and there are some exceptions, but generally knowing what we're doing and getting smarter about how we do it is going to produce more gains than the big costs of significant restructuring, where you can often lose a couple of years by the time people first hear about it through to when an organisation is resettled and able to deliver the kind of service and professionalism that we would all expect. Now, I just want to run you through some examples now of where there's reasonably significant change occurring, generally driven not so much directly by cost savings, although cost savings are involved, but by changing the focus of what we're spending the money on. Probably the largest, most comprehensive change process in the public sector at the moment is in the Defence Forces, where we are setting out, and the Defence Forces themselves are setting out, to ensure that as much resource as possible is focused on their frontline personnel. They want the best equipped, best trained soldier, because we know the high price of that we can pay even when they are very well trained. And are going through the process of moving their resources from the back office, where they have multiple systems that replicate each other, pulling money out of that and pushing it onto frontline equipment and more recently the first pay increase in the Defence Forces for 4 years. Another organisation that has been more controversial in recent times is ACC, but it has gone through major change, and one of the effects of that is that this year we're collecting from New Zealanders $600 million less in levies. That is, households and businesses get to keep that $600 million, and if the performance can be maintained, we have the opportunity to reduce it by another $500 million over the next few years, which would mean more cash in the pockets of people who, every wage earner who currently pays some of the ACC levies. Another example where some of you may be involved is in the justice sector. When we became the government, the justice sector was the fastest rising cost in government, driven by New Zealanders' demands for tougher penalties. But it is very, very expensive. And I must compliment anyone who's involved in that sector, where the government, when it first came in, actually put more money in, particularly to the probation service, which was under real stress then. But since then, the sector, that is police, courts and corrections, have done a very thorough analysis of what actually happens when people come into the justice sector. Some 16-year-old gets arrested by the police. To understand that pipeline, there's a much greater understanding of what happens and who plays what role. One of the effects of that is that for the first time in a generation this year, we will close prisons. And a big chunk of that money saved from prison closure will be put back into the rehabilitation of prisoners to ensure that when they leave, they don't re-offend, as 30% of them do within 12 months. That is going to save us tens of millions more than, and in the long run, hundreds of millions more than restructuring a department sitting in Wellington. And the final example I want to use is welfare. There's been quite a bit of public discussion about welfare changes, but the core of it is that the government has made that decision to invest more up front, to do more for those who are in the welfare system. And we put our money where our mouth is in the last couple of budgets. Over $200 million extra money has actually been put into welfare to support people who need more support to get off benefit. And a good example of that is the young teenage mothers whose children are the most vulnerable people in our community. There's 2,600 of them under the age of 18, and as of the 1st of August, each of them has effectively a supervising adult in their life and greater entitlement to childcare and the greater opportunity to get back into education. Because if you go on the benefit at the age of 17, the average length of stay is 20 years. And we can spend some money now to reduce that long-term cost. Again, an example of the government taking a long-term view. Alongside that, as I think Brenda would point out, in MSD, which is 40% of our public spend, there will be stress and uncertainty as we go through a process of change. And that process of change, though, is designed to do a lot more for tens of thousands more people on benefits. Offer them more support, more choices, more pathways, and more financial support. So we accept there are stresses and workload, we go with it, and we of course will work away with the agency to ensure we achieve what we want, which is more people are supported off welfare and therefore lower long-term costs. Can I just re-emphasise the way that we are focused, taking a longer-term focus? One of the significant initiatives that we've taken deep within the bowels of the system is to try and lengthen the budget process out from a 1-year cycle to a 4-year cycle, so that the people who run your organisations are spending less time trying to manage the minister and play the game of how to get more money, and more time understanding your organisation and how it can be improved and how they can engage the staff. And I guess that's my way I'd sum it up. We want to see more engagement of the staff and less engagement of the minister. Of course, the minister has a role. That's the elected government's role. But in the long term, it is going to be the quality of service at the interface with New Zealanders that makes the difference. And in that context, can I quote the Kiwi Count survey conducted by the State Services Commission. Despite the fact that money is reasonably tight, despite the reality that for some of our organisations there's been some real stress that goes with change, New Zealanders' rating of our public services has in the last couple of years actually lifted slightly. It's actually lifted slightly. And I think that is a tribute to those who deliver the services, who at any given time are going to be worried about whether the management understands what's going on, whether the government understands how much resource is needed to do it properly, but driven by their professionalism and their public service ethic, continue to do a good job. So there is going to be ongoing uncertainty in some organisations. Some have been through their period of maximum uncertainty, some of them still have it ahead of them. At all times we'll be doing our best to provide the resources which will enable the maintenance of good services, but at the same time will be an expectation on those organisations that they can show they're getting the result for which they are given the money, actually getting a better outcome for the community. I'm pretty confident that despite pressures we've had and pressures we'll remain under, we'll continue to meet the expectations of New Zealanders in the public sector. And the reason I'm confident is not because I see a whole lot of money coming down the track. There isn't. There will be targeted increases, such as welfare, as I mentioned. But because of the resilience I have seen in the public services over the last 3 or 4 years, whether people like what they are hearing or not, I've found them willing to express their point of view directly, as the leadership of the PSA always does, or on the front line when I'm hearing from public servants, or on the side of the sports field, which is where I get most of my analysis about what goes on in the public sector, is while I'm watching my kids play sport. People kind of shuffle up beside you and keep their hand over their face and then tell me something I'm not supposed to know. But I do see that resilience, where people just rolled up their sleeves and got on with the job. And I think we will see some real success. You still saw today some figures that showed for the first time in a long time the number of substantiated child abuse cases has actually dropped. I've already indicated to you that we're going to be closing prisons because a number of people we are going to be locking up is flattening out. And actually it might just start dropping. We will see an increase in the children and students achieving through NCEA, the national standards. And of course the public will be expecting us to deliver the transactional services in a more convenient and more accessible way. And I'm confident that despite our differences and the tensions that arise, we'll be able to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. English, for that very wide-ranging address. I'm sure that's given us lots of food for thought. There are a number of people who've got some questions, so we've agreed to make a little time available for that. So we'll move to that quickly. I'm going to ask Bruce McKinley to speak first.
Thank you. Minister, members of the Public Service Association as public servants remain committed to the principle of serving the government of the day with impartial advice. And that's a very important principle. And you've highlighted in your speech the need and expectations of citizens of New Zealand for their public services. And we're also acutely aware, and again you've highlighted it, the financial pressures that the government faces at this time. However, we come back to a fundamental thing that 4 years ago John Key at this Congress in this room made a promise to cap but not cut the numbers of public servants in New Zealand. And since that time, 3,000 public service jobs have been cut. Based on this action versus the words, how can members of this union have trust in your administration going into the future?
Well, look, they'll, I think, make up their own mind about that. If they don't trust the politicians, well, then I can believe anything I say. I think that with respect to the Prime Minister's statements made, the world did change after those statements were made. But I think relative to what's happened, particularly in other countries, he stayed pretty much true to it. The actual, it depends how we count. In fact, the figures are coming out, I think, in the next few weeks. But the total numbers across the public service are actually pretty similar to about 2007 and maybe 2008, I'm not sure. So if you think of how the numbers went through the early 2000s, they rose quite rapidly, particularly in health and education, not so much in the core public service. And then they flattened out and dropped a bit. So the total number is something like 224,000, and it peaked in 2008 at about 226,000. So we can argue about the count. What we do know is some people are losing jobs, that's for sure. And that's the families and the PSA have had to deal with that reality. We're going through a process where we want to ensure that any change reflects financial reality, because we need a sustainable public service, and that where change occurs, the point of it is to get a better result. And I think that's certainly the framework the Prime Minister has set for us. So I think he's been, while the world did change, and he had every reason to be able to say, actually, we're going to have a massive change in the public sector, he has not done that, and has focused on essentially maintaining the funding, some drop in the numbers, and maintaining the public services.
My question to you, for some time now PSA has been pushing for a more effective and efficient bargain, but instead of talking to us about this, the government's pushing through changes to the Employment Relations Act and the State Sector Act, Services Act, aimed at underpinning our ability to participate in collective bargaining. So my questions to you, Mr. English, are why is the government taking this action, and do you think the PSA is the problem?
Yeah, look, I was interested in Brenda's comments about the impact of the current amendments. I'd have to say, if that's how the PSA said, it's certainly not what we set out to do. And I'd be interested in further discussion about that. And the way the government approaches the collective bargaining has been to set some broad parameters, and yes, they have been pretty tight, but it has allowed, wage rises each year. I see in the last year the average base pay rose 3%, which I believe is excessive. These are the public sector measures that are going to be published, and actually I thought it looked a bit high too, given the wage settlements that I see going past. So I'll go back and find out about the number. The point being that we set these broad parameters, and the broad parameters are designed to enable continued increase in pay, because people work hard and they want to maintain their standard of living and so on. That's quite reasonable. At the same time as recognising the fiscal constraints we've got. And then the collective bargaining process goes on within that. Now, from what Brenda said, there's a view that the current legislation is going to somehow narrow the scope of collective bargaining. I don't think that's the case, but we'll go and happy to have the discussion so that we can all be happy with getting what we think we're after. So it's not our intention to undermine the PSA role in bargaining. I mean, that's been carried out in an effective and orderly and sometimes pretty tense environment, but I think it's been carried out in a way that has reflected the broader reality of where the public are and where the finances are. and we don't have a major problem about it. And we do understand the frustration, that we've got to be careful about the frustration of, a longer term period under tight constraint. People can say, well, I'm sick of it, I'm off to Australia or whatever. We don't want to lose good, effective people out of the public sector, and we know that paying conditions are part of retaining them. But we also know that another thing that PSA is after is an engagement in solving the problems and making the changes is also part of what makes the job attractive. And where we see that working, it is fantastic, generates great solutions, better solutions than change consultants or ministers or whatever. And where we don't see it, people aren't that happy, and because they just feel the pressure without seeing the benefits.
And one last question.
Minister, you will no doubt be aware of the Human Rights Commission caring report counts released recently and the subsequent publicity in the aged care sector. On behalf of community public servants, support workers and the PSA, I am requesting if you would commit to working alongside a community support worker in your Southland area to see firsthand what these underpaid and undervalued hard-working workers do in the course of their daily lives to change the lives of others. A similar project called Walk a Day in My Shoes was undertaken by MPs 2 years ago, and some of your colleagues, Chester Burrows and Eric Roy, did accept such an invitation and undertake this experience. So on behalf of my work associates, would you accept this invitation, Minister?
Well, look, I'll have a look at it, but if the point you want to make is do politicians understand what it's like for workers? Without going into detail, I can tell you, yes, I do. That's not really, if the issue is paying conditions in the sector, then, we've got to work on that issue in the context of the other trade-offs, particularly through the health sector, but also ACC. I think there's a broad level of public empathy for the work that our carers do. I think it's actually reasonably well understood as pretty difficult. And I think everyone understands it's a type of work that needs personal commitment and dedication. You can't just kind of turn up for work and go through the motions. So I think that's well understood, but it doesn't, I guess, deal with your next question, which would be about how can the paying conditions be improved. And I can't deal with that question with you right here today.
Last one.
Minister, there's a bill in Parliament extending paid parental leave to 26 weeks. With the information you were working with, you have said that you would veto it as we could afford it, despite the majority of MPs supporting the bill. Now your officials have said that their initial costings was no estimated. The proposal was to phase in the 26 weeks over the next 4 years when you've said the economy will be recovering. As the government has said that it's about helping families and children to have a good start in life, and in doing so, as you said this morning, better outcomes, do you still intend to veto the bill?
Yes, I do, and that's just because of mainly because of a clear sense of priority. Okay, there are some things we can afford, but paid parental leave's not at the top of that list. We have, as I've said, with respect to families and children, our top priority has been the young children of young mothers, because they are people who traditionally we have said, here's the cash, we're putting it in you're a 17-year-old, you're wandering around the Hutt Valley, and we just put your benefit in your bank account and leave it to it. Now, there's others in the community who may be offering support, but certainly not the government. And we think they are very vulnerable people. And then we've got the next sort of group of children, which is the ones who are the subject of 120,000 notifications of potential abuse. Now, by far the majority of those turn out not to be real problems, but enough of them are severe problems that we know we ought to do something about it, because some of those kids end up dead because we didn't do anything. indeed you can't, because you couldn't do anything about it anyway. So that just to give you a sense of priority. So your paid parental leave is a good thing. It's been funded right through this process. We maintain all support for families and actually indexed most of it. So it's gone up with the cost of living. But in terms of the priorities of where the next dollar goes, that one's just down the list.